Now, from Wish TV, your local news source, this is All Indiana Politics.
Good Sunday morning. Welcome to another edition of All Indiana Politics. I'm Phil Sanchez, one of Indiana's newest members of Congress, already on the front lines of two major issues. Congressman Rudy Yakim was elected to succeed the late Jackie Walorski in northern Indiana. He has been named to the House Budget Committee and the Transportation Committee. This comes just in time for fights over the debt ceiling and the train derailment in Ohio. He talked to our government reporter, Garrett Berquist.
Let's welcome in Congressman Rudy Yakim. Congressman, thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be with you.
So you had to jump into Congress right away after winning the special election to succeed the late Congresswoman Jackie Walorski. Tell me about how these first few months have gone for you.
Well, thanks for mentioning Jackie. Of course, I wish the circumstances within which I took office were different. Yeah, our district misses her. She was a dear friend of mine, but we'll be honoring her legacy as I continue forward. So in terms of the first few months, I was sworn in on November 14th. That gave me a bit of a strategic advantage in terms of being able to understand what life was like in the minority for 6 weeks and what life is now like in the majority. And those two things are demonstrably different.
So now you're on the House Budget Committee. Right now, what is on the table in terms of spending cuts? Republican leaders have taken both Social Security and Medicare off of the table.
That's right. And what we're talking about on the House Budget Committee right now is, number one, the president should come to the table and negotiate with us in terms of the overall debt ceiling increase. Historically, when there's a debt ceiling limit that we're going to hit, which we will hit sometime over the summer, the president, the House, and the Senate come together and negotiate. And all we're looking for is some really simple things in exchange for a debt ceiling increase. It's things like in our budget chair, Jody Arrington, who I've been talking with extensively about this, has been very clear about some very simple things like going forward and freezing discretionary spending, rewinding the tape maybe a year or two, and going back to 2022 levels of discretionary spending. We're looking for some pretty simple things that ought to be able to help us close the gap on our overall budget deficit, which, as we all know, is unsustainable.
What are some things that you personally would like to see? Any specific programs that you think need to be dialed back?
Well, as opposed to specific programs, what I'd like to see is very simply across the board, we go forward in the 2024 fiscal year at 2022 spending levels. To me, that makes the most sense. It's a really simple way of doing it. It would help us close the budget gap of what is projected to be a $1.4 trillion deficit going into next year. I'm hearing loud and clear from constituents up here in the 2nd District about the issue of inflation. That affects everyone from senior citizens whose costs are going up faster than their incomes. It's affecting small businesses and their ability to hire. It's affecting rail, transportation, energy prices, and it's all caused by the level of imbalance that we're experiencing in our federal budget. And so we need to start to bring that into balance without doing damage to anyone that is a recipient of federal funds.
Why hold the full faith and credit of the United States hostage over these budget negotiations? Why risk the damage from a default?
Well, let me be clear. We will not default on our debt. We have never done that before, and we will not do that through the course of these negotiations. That being said, it is appropriate for us to have a negotiation about what the future of federal spending looks like. The president should, and I believe that he will, come to the negotiating table and negotiate with House Republicans over what the level of spending will be going forward into the next year. There is a historical practice and a historical precedent that's been set, including by the president when he was vice president and even in the Senate, that we negotiate with each other. I think that that's what the American people expect, and that's what we'll deliver on.
Now, you also serve on the House Transportation Committee. There are a number of rail lines that run through your district, including at least one that's operated by Norfolk Southern. Should Congress change the hazardous materials reporting requirement in light of the Ohio derailment?
Well, first of all, our hearts certainly go out to the people in East Palestine. Their community was rocked in a way that few communities have been in the past by this train derailment. The administration, as well as Norfolk Southern, need to come together and work extensively on making sure that that repairs are done, not only to the rail line, but also that community is restored to the way it was prior to that train derailment. So let's start with that. Secondly, I think it's far too early to really actually understand what actually happened. There's a number of people that have jumped to conclusions on both sides of the aisle, as well as the administration. And I think what we need to do is make sure that we fully understand what's happened, why it's happened, and what we need to do to prevent it before we jump into solutionizing, which is the natural and easy thing to do early on after a tragedy like this.
Should people who live near railroad tracks be concerned about something similar happening?
Well, I think Americans are right to be concerned across the board. There are a number of unanswered questions as it relates to this derailment. We need answers not only from Norfolk Southern, but we also need answers from the administration. We need to see a plan from the administration on how we're going to clean this up and what we're going to do to prevent something like this from happening in the future.
News 8 has learned that railroads don't have to report flammable liquids unless a train has at least 35 cars in it. Should that be changed?
Well, again, I think that we need to really understand what caused this accident to happen. If they would have had to report it, would that have prevented this accident from happening? I don't think so. There's no evidence so far to show that a different regulatory environment would have prevented this accident. What I'd like to do is wait for the report to come out, understand what actually happened, and then look at the leading indicators that we can change that would have actually prevented the accident from happening. Sometimes in government, we have this itch to go and do something right away. And oftentimes the things that we do, they might make us feel better, but they don't actually resolve it and they don't actually prevent it from happening again. I'd like to find out what actually happened and then get into understanding what we need to do to prevent it from happening again.
Do you foresee the House Transportation Committee holding some serious discussions about that based on whatever the NTSB finds in its final report?
I do. So I'm also on the Railroad Subcommittee on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee. We actually received a briefing, a bipartisan briefing last week on some of the things that we know so far in this. And I expect that this will be a big issue for quite some time within not only the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, but even more so the Railroad Subcommittee that I do serve on.
Tell me a little bit more about some of the things that came out of that briefing.
They talked about, the fact that Norfolk Southern has now come to the table and they're calling for a complete restoration of the town. Norfolk Southern's committed to doing that. And one of the things that we'll be doing on that railroad subcommittee is just making sure that Norfolk Southern follows through with that. They've also talked about the fact that the federal government is now getting more engaged. I personally thought, and a number of people thought, that they were a little bit late to the game. But the federal government's now getting more engaged with some of our federal agencies that exercise oversight on safety. And there's a number of federal regulators and inspectors that are on site right now to better understand and determine what happened.
All right, coming up, the Indiana House has approved its version of the budget. In their own words, hear how top budget writers want to spend your money over the next 2 years. Welcome back. Well, it's now up to the state Senate how to spend your tax dollars. The House has passed its version of the budget for the next 2 years. The chair and the top-ranking Democrat from the House Ways and Means Committee outlined some of the highlights and what got left out.
If I had to describe House Bill 1001 in a single word, just one only, I'd have to use the word opportunity. It's opportunity for students, for families, for adults, for Hoosiers to improve their lives and have a brighter and better future. It decreases the tax cut or the tax rate. The tax cut right now in code, it has several provisions and it has to be certain things here and there. It just makes it flat happen. Beginning January 1 of 2024 to 3%. And in January 1 of 26 to 2.9%, saving Hoosiers over $470 million over the biennium, $2 billion for K-12. And about $1.6 billion of that goes through the funding formula. $700 million additional in FY24 and $875 in FY25, for a grand total of about $1.6 billion through the formula. Increases the foundation by 4% the first year, 0.7% the second. Want to note the complexity index, for the first time since I can recall, actually increases at a higher percent than the foundation. We increase the special education grants by 5% each year.
The budget is unreasonable because the stated promise to provide real great school funding formula for traditional schools, from our perspective, was not honored. It was not honored because even though we talked about tuition support increase about $9 billion, the allocation of those dollars do not go direct. A lot of those dollars are directed to non-public, non-traditional public schools. Traditional public schools had an unfunded mandate in 1001, will require schools to not only, and once you catch this, not only pay for textbooks out of the revenue they receive, but also the free and reduced lunch textbook that the states had picked up. Now the local school corporations are responsible for those dollars. The budget is unreasonable, ladies and gentlemen, because it leaves much to be desired. Another 2 years of having money, nothing being done to provide anything for the human infrastructure here within the state of Indiana. It doesn't help support individuals in their jobs, the assurance that their children can care for positions. It doesn't help with economic development from our perspective in a meaningful way to help move things into the future. We have, with this budget, which is an unreasonable budget, a missed opportunity, so many dreams deferred and denied because of the minimal contributions of this budget. I just want to ratchet back what we did over here and ask the Senate to help us do that. Turn it back a little bit.
All right, coming up, Indiana's best political team examines the budget, legislation on transgender youth, and the Ohio train derailment. And welcome back to All Indiana Politics on this Sunday as we welcome in two members of Indiana's best political team, Democrat Kip Tew and Republican Tom John. Gentlemen, good to see you. Lots to get to today. Let's begin with the big development in the 2024 election. Attorney General Todd Rokita says he will run for another term in office. He will not run for governor or Senate, as some have speculated. Tom, this is the third major candidate to skip out on that Senate race. Does this effectively hand the Senate primary, in your opinion, to Congressman Jim Banks?
Certainly, it appears right now that Congressman Banks is definitely in the driver's seat in this race. Obviously, AG Rokita would have been a strong candidate and has had a statewide profile for a lot of time, done a lot of work in the Attorney General's office. You've seen other people move, and a lot of people, frankly, coalescing around Jim that are the political people who oftentimes are the early selectors and the earlier people to get on campaigns. So I think it's a strong indication for his race.
Kip, we now have Republicans announcing in two of next year's three biggest elections, rather, I should say. We still haven't heard, though, anything from Democrats. Could this hurt Democrats' image going into the election, particularly among swing voters?
Well, I don't think swing voters are paying attention to who's running for election a year and a half out or 2 years out. So I don't think it has any effect. Just a word on Rokita. I think he made the correct decision because running for governor, being governor, you actually have to be competent and be able to make the trains run on time. And he's nothing more than a performative politician. So it's probably right that he sits in the AG's office and continues to play performance politics.
Should we expect Democrats' announcements when the legislature ends?
Yeah, I would say that's probably right. It will probably have at least one person not announce they're running for governor. Could be a couple more. I know there's several people looking at it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's right. That's it.
Well, as far as Todd Rokita goes, though, Kip, and since you brought him up, he's currently under investigation, as you very well know, by the disciplinary board for his investigation into the doctor who performed an abortion on a 10-year-old rape victim from Ohio. Does that give Democrats, Kip, any leverage here?
It could. We'll have to wait and see what the results of the investigation are. But I mean, Todd Rokita is a classic Trumpian performative politician who doesn't do his job seriously. And he's only interested in getting headlines and playing to his base. He's not really that interested in being an effective attorney general.
Tom, depending on what the board decides, if anything, could this hurt Rokita's bid for another term?
I mean, obviously you can't comment on disciplinary actions or what's gone on there, but, you know, regardless, I think that Kip isn't quite fair with the AG's record. I mean, he's got a record of serving the state as Secretary of State, as a member of Congress, and has been somebody who's been active bringing $1 billion back to the state of Indiana with regard to various actions he's taken on behalf of the state and Hoosiers. So I don't think at the end of the day it's going to affect it. And, you know, at the end of the day, too, you got to have somebody to beat somebody. And I don't see anybody on the Democrat side stepping up to actually take him on.
Well, we'll see what happens there. Let's move to the General Assembly, if you don't mind. In two bills, some say are targeting transgender people. The House passed a bill to require teachers to notify parents if a student wants to change their pronouns. A Senate committee approved the bill to prohibit any form of medical gender transition care for minors. Tom, we've got one bill pitched as a parental rights bill. The other takes away a parent's right to decide on medical care. How do you square those two?
Well, that's what happens when bills cross the legislative chamber or the atrium and go to the other house. I mean, you know, the process in the legislature is a messy one, and different people are trying to represent different constituencies and taking testimony and taking insights from all of the people inside the hallways. I think we're a long way from it, and I think that conversation really comes up in about a month and a half, and right now, it's too early to tell.
Kip, I want to get your thoughts on that as well, but we did hear from some people who detransitioned and have serious health concerns. Should there be some additional oversight here?
Well, what I hope happens, in the very least, is that that parents still have the ability to do what's in the best, what they believe in the best interest of their child when it comes to these issues. They're very difficult. They're very personal, you know, and they're very rare. And I think that we ought to leave it between the doctor, the parents, and the child as to what kind of services what kind of medical services they need. I don't know that we're going to get there. I don't. The testimony was heart-wrenching on both sides, but the parents of the transgendered kids who testified, I think, is some of the most riveting and difficult testimony I've witnessed in all my years at the legislature. And I just wish the legislature would listen to those parents, because they were anguished. They spent years trying to do what the right thing is for their child, and for them to have to listen to saying, you know, the decision you made is fundamentally wrong and we shouldn't let anybody else make it, to me is just awful.
Let's move on to the budget, specifically school funding. Schools get more basic funding as well as greater complexity index funding. Voucher eligibility gets expanded dramatically, and it would end textbook fees. Kip, why not give more parents the option to send their children elsewhere?
Well, fundamentally, I think vouchers violates the Constitution. I know the Indiana, it's the opposite. The courts have held opposite, but I think it mixes religion and tax dollars, and I think it's fundamentally wrong. And I think that, you know, it shouldn't be, and we're going to expand it to people up to $220,000 income a year. And so basically we're going to have a complete third kind of education system in the state of Indiana. The upside might be that, you know.
Tom, I want to get you in here as well. 30 seconds left. Take us home.
Sorry.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the legislature is trying to invest in the most important asset we have, which is our children, and make sure parents have an opportunity to give their children the best opportunity to be the next great citizens of our state, and ensure that we become and continue to be a great state in the union.
All right. Gentlemen, good to see you. Always a good time. We'll talk soon, and we'll be right back. All right, thank you for joining us for All Indiana Politics this week. We'll be back here next Sunday morning at 9:30, as always, and you can also find our brand new All Indiana Politics podcast. It's part of the All Indiana Podcast Network at wishtv.com. Have a great rest of your weekend.